They called me cursed. A shadow wearing human skin. For 10 years, I hid, sweeping kitchens, scrubbing blood from floors, pretending to be one of them. I thought I was safe, until the night he walked in, eyes glowing like molten gold, voice like thunder breaking a storm, and he spoke my true name. For Shadow, but his claim over me, would change the fate of every creature in this realm. Elara, known only as Ember to the palace staff, moved silently through the shadowed kitchens of Dravenheart Palace, the glow of flickering sconces painting golden pools of light over stone floors slick with steam and spilled broth, her thin figure gliding between bustling servants like a wraith that no one dared acknowledge, the scent of roasted venison, honey-glazed root vegetables, and spiced wine clinging stubbornly to her hair and simple linen dress, a fragrance that had become her identity, far more than her name, for she was a girl without one in the eyes of those who passed her each day without a glance, her shoulders hunched inward as though she could fold herself small enough to vanish entirely, her steps soundless out of instinct rather than training, and in that invisibility she found safety, the only shield she had ever known since the world had been set aflame and her people slaughtered. 10 long years had passed since the Great Purge, a decade of swallowing her radiance, binding her celestial essence beneath a glamour so potent it seared through her blood like molten iron, burning her veins with every heartbeat, yet she endured the pain, wore the disguise like shackles, because exposure meant death. If anyone saw the faint starlight beneath her skin or glimpsed the shimmer that once crowned her as royalty of a forgotten race, they would call her an abomination, drag her by her hair before the sanctum of iron, and cast her body into cleansing fire to erase her existence from history's memory. She carried that knowledge in every breath, every movement, every time she lowered her gaze to avoid an inquisitive stare, and yet, no one here suspected a thing. To them, she was Ember, the servant girl who mopped floors until her knees ached, scrubbed dishes until her hands bled raw, and moved through the palace kitchens like a ghost tethered to a life she didn't deserve. A shadow among mortals who never realized the crown she once wore was stained with the ashes of her kin. Master Orwin, the palace's grizzled head cook, barked her name, his voice rough like gravel, yet without venom, for he was not cruel, simply hardened by decades of feeding kings and courtiers who never remembered his face, and Ember obeyed without hesitation, dipping her chin in deference as she murmured softly, "Yes, master," her voice barely louder than a whisper, then slipped past shelves lined with spices from faraway lands, past cauldrons bubbling over roaring fires, past servants bustling like ants, her hands steady though her heart fluttered with the anxiety of simply existing in a world that would kill her if it ever truly looked her way. She filled a bucket at the well, her reflection trembling on the water's surface, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw her true self staring back, eyes glowing faintly like moonlight behind a veil, a face both familiar and alien, framed by a halo of starlight that no longer existed except in memory, and she quickly averted her gaze, swallowing hard as if she could push the ache of her identity down into the pit of her stomach where all her secrets lived. At night, she often whispered that name, Elara, to herself like a prayer, a reminder of a life stolen, of a bloodline erased, of a mother's arms that once held her before those same arms became claws of shadow and destruction, twisted by hunger and grief, haunting her dreams with every scream of the dying celestials, every flicker of fire that painted her memories red. She woke most mornings drenched in sweat, her trembling hands clutching her blanket, staring at the dark ceiling of her tiny attic room, gasping for breath as though smoke still filled her lungs, then rose silently to begin the day's labor before dawn, blending into the palace like an unnoticed shadow. Tonight, however, the air thrummed differently, there was an energy pulsing through the halls, a hum of voices that refused to settle, servants whispering to one another as they darted about, carrying trays of crystal goblets, polishing silver until their fingers ached, hanging banners stitched with the royal crest of a wolf crowned in gold, the atmosphere tinged with a nervous excitement that set Ember on edge. She overheard fragments of conversation as she scrubbed the marble floors. "The Alpha King is here tonight. They say he's not fully wolf." Another servant hissed, "Quiet, don't speak of him like that." A third voice, trembling with curiosity, murmured, "I heard his eyes glow brighter than torchlight." Ember kept her head bowed, her hands raw against the stone as she scoured away muddy boot prints, the scent of fresh greenery and rain carried in from the carriages outside. Nobles were gathering like vultures, draped in silks and jewels, their laughter echoing through the vaulted corridors, but Ember stayed far from the ballroom, preferring the familiar warmth of the kitchens and the soothing routine of work, her heart steady so long as she stayed unseen. She dipped her rag into a bucket of soapy water, wrung it out until her fingers cramped, and pressed it to the floor again, her movements methodical, mechanical, as though scrubbing away every memory that haunted her, the screams of her people ringing faintly in her ears like distant bells she could never silence. The glamour burned against her skin, a reminder that she was alive only because she wore this mask, because she was willing to dim her own light until she was nothing but a shadow. She listened to the laughter of passing nobles as they swept by in velvet cloaks, ignoring her existence entirely, their jeweled heels clacking against the clean marble she had polished for them, and for a moment, she was grateful for their disdain. It was easier to survive when no one cared to look. Yet as the evening wore on, she felt something gnaw at the edges of her awareness, a prickling sensation like G watched, though every time she glanced up, there was no one there. She shrugged it off, focusing on her work, scrubbing until her knuckles turned red, until the scent of lye clung to her hands, until exhaustion wrapped itself around her bones like a familiar shroud. And still, she avoided the grandeur of the celebration unfolding just beyond the kitchen doors, content to remain invisible, content to stay far from danger, far from the eyes of wolves and nobles alike, far from the memory of what she had once been. She convinced herself she preferred it this way, preferred the safety of shadows over the terror of exposure. She was a ghost, a servant, a nameless girl no one would ever remember. And that was how she meant to survive. Or so she thought. The air in the kitchen thickened the moment his name whispered through Ember's mind, and she found herself pressing her flour-dusted palms against the edge of the counter to steady her trembling hands, her breath shallow, her senses sharpening as though her body already recognized a predator in its midst before her mind had even registered his presence. Kaelin Dravenheart, the Alpha King. The name was enough to make seasoned warriors lower their voices and cross themselves with charms, a name spoken only in the safety of whispers, never in jest, never in light, for it carried with it the weight of bloodlines older than any mortal history, stories of a beast cloaked in man's flesh, a king not bound by the moon but by something older, darker, and far more primal. Ember had always dismissed those tales as exaggerated warnings, legends spun by frightened tongues, yet now, standing barefoot on the cold kitchen floor, the scent of wood smoke and roasted venison clinging to her hair, she felt a prickle along her spine that made every instinct in her body scream to flee. The servants around her chattered nervously, their words frag me. Ted and trembling with awe, his eyes glow like molten fire, one hissed under her breath as she chopped carrots with shaking hands. They say he doesn't smell like wolf at all, another muttered, glancing toward the hall as though the mere thought of him might summon him. They say he kills with a single look, a young boy whispered, his hands clutching a tray so tightly his knuckles blanched. Ember bent her head lower, her chest tightening as she wiped her hands on her apron, smearing white streaks of flour across worn fabric, trying to steady her breath as if she could melt into the background like she always had, just another servant in a palace of shadows. But her heartbeat betrayed her, drumming against her ribs like warning drums, the pulse in her throat fluttering violently as the heavy kitchen door swung open without warning, slamming against the stone wall with a force that silenced the room in an instant. The sound of voices died mid-sentence, knives and ladles clattered softly to counters as every servant froze, and Ember, though she tried not to, looked up. He filled the doorway like a living shadow. Kaelin Dravenheart, the Alpha King, massive and imposing, his broad shoulders seemed too large for the frame of the door, his tall form draped in black leathers that fit like armor, the material creaking softly as he moved. The air seemed to grow colder around him, not with the chill of winter, but with the oppressive weight of his presence, and Ember's breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze. Golden. That was the first word that came to mind, but even that paled in comparison to the truth. His eyes burned like molten metal, like sunlight trapped in a predator's stare, glowing with a feral intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone straight into the core of her being. She felt stripped bare beneath that look, her glamour trembling against her skin like a fragile veil that might unravel under the weight of his attention. She wanted to lower her gaze, but her body was frozen, every instinct torn between fleeing and kneeling, the pull of fear and fascination tangling inside her like a snare. His presence filled the entire room. He did not need to speak to command silence. No servant dared to move, no one dared breathe too loudly, and Ember's pulse roared in her ears like the sea in a storm. She told herself she was no one, a nameless girl with calloused hands and raw knuckles, a servant whose face no noble would remember, but the way his head tilted ever so slightly shattered that illusion. He was scenting the air, scenting her. It was subtle, yet devastating, a movement that reminded her he was not merely a man but a predator cloaked in human skin, a creature that hunted with instinct so sharp it cut through lies and disguises like silk. Ember's chest tightened, her fingers gripping the wooden counter so hard her nails bit into the grain, her breath shallow as she lowered her eyes quickly, pretending to scrub a clean surface, willing herself to vanish into her role, to be invisible again, to be nothing but a shadow in the kitchen. Yet she could feel his gaze, like fire tracing the outline of her form, searing through the glamour that had kept her safe for a decade. The scent of him filled the room now, carried on a cold draft from the hallway, pine forests after rain, steel, smoke, and something older, something wild that had no name in any mortal tongue, a primal darkness that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. He did not speak, but silence followed him like a cloak, the quiet so sharp it rang in her ears, amplifying the sound of her own shallow breaths. Time stretched unbearably, each second dragging like hours as she scrubbed the counter with mechanical motions, heart hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it, certain he could smell her fear, certain he could sense every secret she had buried beneath her skin. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft thud, and life in the kitchen returned in a rush of whispers and nervous glances, servants exhaling shakily as if they had all been holding their breath. But Ember could not steady herself so easily, her knees felt weak, her fingers still trembled, and her chest heaved with a fear she could not explain, a fear that wasn't entirely fear at all, something else simmering beneath the surface, a strange, dangerous pull she didn't understand. She leaned against the counter, pressing a flower-streaked hand to her chest, feeling her heart pound so violently it hurt, the sound echoing in her ears like war drums calling soldiers to battle, and no matter how many deep breaths she took, no matter how much she tried to shake it off, she could not escape the truth etched into her bones. He had seen her, truly seen her, and something in the way his gaze lingered told her she would not be able to disappear so easily ever again. Ember's fingers trembled as she steadied the tray, the weight of crystal goblets cutting into her palms as she forced herself to keep moving, weaving through the swirling silk skirts and sharp-shouldered coats of nobles who didn't see her as anything more than part of the furniture. The chandeliers above sparkled like frozen constellations, their candlelight flickering off polished marble floors and towering golden pillars, and the entire ballroom smelled of honeyed wine, roasted meat, and the sharp tang of perfume so thick it clung to her tongue like ash. Each noble's laughter rang like brittle glass, empty and cold, while the music swelled from the far end of the room, a slow, haunting melody played by a string quartet tucked into the shadows of the dais where the Alpha King himself sat, draped in darkness like a living statue. Ember kept her eyes down, careful not to catch anyone's gaze, but she could feel the tension thickening around her like fog, as if every step she took brought her closer to danger she couldn't name. The tray wobbled when a passing noble's sleeve brushed her arm, and she whispered a silent prayer that she'd make it across the ballroom without incident. But fate, as always, had other plans. A sharp voice sliced through the music like a blade, freezing her in place. "Watch where you're going, kitchen rat," Cassian Vaylor sneered, his tone dripping disdain, and Ember's stomach dropped as she turned to face the towering noble, his perfectly styled dark hair and jewel-studded coat making him gleam like wealth itself, while his cold blue eyes looked at her as though she were something to scrape from his boots. She opened her mouth to murmur an apology, but before she could speak, Cassian's hand shot out, knocking the tray slightly, and a splash of crimson wine streaked down her sleeve, staining the threadbare fabric she wore like a mark of shame. Gasps and muffled laughter rippled through the small crowd nearby, and Ember's cheeks burned hot as whispers slithered between painted lips and jeweled fans. "Pathetic creature," Cassian said, his voice loud enough to draw more attention, his mouth curling into a cruel smirk as he reached out as if to brush her shoulder, only to flick the empty air like she wasn't even worth touching. Ember ducked her head, biting her lip hard enough to taste blood, forcing herself to bow low in silent apology because words wouldn't help. They never did. Her heart pounded in her chest, a trapped bird fluttering wildly as she wished, not for the first time, that she could vanish entirely, dissolve into mist and leave these marble floors and cruel eyes behind forever. She felt the sting of humiliation burn hotter than the wine soaking her skin, but she didn't move, didn't retaliate, because she couldn't. Not here, not now. She took a trembling breath, lowering herself slightly, whispering a soft, "My lord," in a voice barely audible over the violins, and that only made Cassion's smile widen, as if her submission fed him like wine itself. Around them, nobles snickered behind jeweled masks of politeness, their whispers carrying like venomous threads through the air, and Ember thought she might drown under the weight of all those eyes. She clutched the tray tighter, knuckles white, willing herself not to cry because tears would only amuse them more. Her mind screamed at her to leave, to get away from his mocking stare, but her body was frozen, her legs locked in place by fear stronger than steel. And then she felt it, a prickling at the back of her neck, a sensation like fire crawling under her skin. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her eyes just enough to scan the crowd, and that's when she saw him. King Kaelan Dravenheart sat upon the raised dais, shadows curling around his tall, broad frame like living cloaks, his black attire stark against the golden throne behind him. He was lounging casually, goblet of wine in hand, but there was nothing lazy about his gaze. Those molten gold eyes burned through the sea of bodies and locked directly onto her, pinning her in place as surely as chains. Ember's breath caught, her heart slamming painfully in her chest as she realized he wasn't looking at Cassion, or the cluster of whispering nobles. He was watching her. Watching her like a hawk watching a rabbit, or something older and far more dangerous studying prey it had already decided to claim. She wanted to look away, to drop her gaze, but she couldn't. Something in those golden eyes rooted her to the spot, her fingers tightening around the tray until she was sure the glass would shatter. The hum of conversation dimmed in her ears, the music fading to a distant echo, and for a moment, all she knew was that scorching stare, sharp enough to peel away every layer of her disguise. Her glamour pulsed faintly under her skin, a subtle flicker of magic she prayed no one else could see, but she had the terrifying sense that Kaelan could see straight through her, past her servant's rags and hunched shoulders, past the dirt on her hands, to something she had buried so deep it should have been impossible to find. She tore her eyes away, forcing herself to kneel slightly, as though her movement had been nothing but deference to the king, but the weight of his gaze followed her, wrapping around her like invisible chains. Cassion smirked again, oblivious to the tension sparking between her and his king, and he flicked his wrist dismissively, gesturing for her to clean up the spill as if she weren't shaking from something far greater than embarrassment. Ember's mind raced as she turned away, kneeling to wipe at the crimson stain on the marble floor, her hands moving automatically while her thoughts tangled in panic and confusion. Why had he looked at her like that? He was the Alpha King, a man of legend, said to be cursed by a beast older than time itself. Rumors of his brutality were whispered in every village, tales of his monstrous strength, his piercing eyes that could make wolves bow in terror. And yet, when he'd looked at her, it hadn't felt like cruelty. It had felt like recognition. Ember swallowed hard, finishing her task quickly, and rose with her tray still trembling in her hands, keeping her head low as she retreated toward the safety of the kitchen doors. But even with her back turned, she could feel the weight of that golden gaze lingering, burning, as though the Alpha King himself had marked her without touching her, and the thought sent a shiver down her spine so sharp she nearly stumbled over her own feet. She forced herself to keep moving, weaving through laughing nobles and swirling gowns, but her breath came shallow, her heart hammering with an unfamiliar fear she couldn't quite name, because deep down she knew something had changed tonight, something she couldn't undo. Ember stood frozen, her breath clouding in the icy courtyard air, every nerve sparking as though his words had burned into her skin. The night was utterly still except for the whisper of snow again. St. Stone and the faint rustle of pine branches bowing under their frost, and yet his presence lingered like a shadow, thick and alive, even though he had already vanished from sight. She clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, trembling, not from the cold but from the echo of his voice, low and rough like gravel sliding over steel, a voice that carried a weight of dominance that made her bones want to kneel and her heart want to flee. And yet she found herself rooted to the spot, staring at the place where he'd melted back into darkness, her pulse hammering so loudly she feared someone would hear it. Her mind spun wildly, trying to make sense of the way he'd looked at her, like a predator not quite ready to strike but unwilling to let its prey escape, and the words he'd spoken, soft but certain, "You hide well, but not from me," repeated over and over in her head until she wanted to clamp her hands over her ears to block them out. A shiver ran down her spine as she finally forced herself to move, turning her gaze upward where the moon shone pale and distant, silver light dripping over the palace walls like cold silk, and for the first time in years she felt utterly exposed, as though her carefully maintained glamour, the spell she'd sacrificed blood and years to uphold, had been ripped open by a single glance, and yet no one else had noticed, no one else had paused or gasped or whispered, and that terrified her even more because it meant he alone had seen through her mask, the memory of his eyes, gold like molten fire, sharp enough to cut through lies, sent another wave of fear laced with something unnameable flooding through her chest, a feeling that wasn't entirely unpleasant despite the danger, and that realization made her throat tighten. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall, squeezing her eyes shut for a moment, but the scent of him clung to the night air, cedar and wild earth and something darker, something that didn't belong to wolves or men, a primal aura that reminded her of stories whispered in frightened voices when she was a child. St. Ares of the Beast King whose very blood carried ancient magic. She'd always dismissed those tales as superstition, until tonight, until his shadow brushed past hers and made her heart leap into her throat. Drawing in a shaky breath, she crouched to straighten the hem of her plain servant's dress, fingers trembling as they fumbled over the fabric, desperate to busy herself with something mundane, but her mind refused to settle, replaying the way he had commanded her to lift her head and the impossible warmth of his gaze when she obeyed, warmth that shouldn't have been there in a man whose name made courtiers pale and warriors bow. She hugged herself tighter, feeling small beneath the towering walls of Dravenheart Palace, the courtyard stretching endlessly around her like an empty arena, its silence broken only by the soft gurgle of the fountain at its center and the whisper of frostbitten wind curling around the marble statues. Her breath hitched as she thought of how he had stepped from those shadows like they belonged to him, as though the darkness itself bent to his will, and she realized with a jolt that even if she ran now, even if she locked herself away, he would still be able to find her because something in his tone had been a promise, not a threat, a vow that he would not lose her. The thought should have terrified her more than it already did, but deep inside, where her carefully walled-off memories and buried truths lay hidden, a faint ember of longing flickered, longing to be seen, truly seen, after years of being invisible, of swallowing her voice and dimming her light. Shaking her head fiercely, Ember forced herself to straighten, forcing that flicker back into darkness, because she couldn't afford to feel anything but fear when it came to the Alpha King, not when she was balancing on the edge of discovery, not when every beat of her heart was a risk. Gla. Sing toward the tall oak doors that led back to the ballroom. She could still hear faint strains of music drifting through, laughter and clinking goblets, a world so far removed from her own that it felt like she was peering through a window into another life. She took one tentative step forward, her slipper crunching lightly on the thin dusting of snow, and then another, her senses stretched so taut she thought she might shatter if anyone spoke her name. But no one called to her, no one stopped her, and yet his presence clung like a cloak to her shoulders, making her feel as though invisible eyes followed every movement. She couldn't decide if that thought made her want to hide deeper in the shadows or turn and search the darkness for him, but she dared neither. Her hands brushed against the rough stone railing of the courtyard steps as she moved toward the doorway, her breath coming quicker now, and the ancient runes etched into the palace walls seemed to hum faintly under her fingertips, a subtle magic thrumming there, a reminder that this place was steeped in power older than kingdoms, a place where someone like her didn't belong. She slipped through the doors without making a sound, sliding back into the bustling warmth of the servants' hallway, but even the noise and heat couldn't erase the chill he had left behind, nor could it slow the pounding of her heart, for though she'd escaped his presence physically, the memory of his words, his scent, his piercing gaze, followed her like a haunting melody that would not fade, and deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. Ember's breath caught in her throat as the heavy wooden door creaked wider, the smell of hay and lantern oil thick in the chilled air, and Cashin's arrogant silhouette filled the frame, his smirk slicing through the dim light like a blade, his voice dripping mockery as he addressed the Alpha King with a deliberate lack of reverence, forcing Ember to shrink back instinctively, her trembling hands gripping her apron as if the rough fabric could anchor her to safety, while Kaelin stood unflinching, a wall of silent dominance radiating from him, the golden glow in his eyes sharpening like a predator cornered, though his stance was calm, calculated, every inch of him speaking power without motion, making the air heavy, thick with tension, and Ember felt like prey caught between two predators of very different kinds, one whose hunger felt primal yet protective, the other whose smile hinted at cruelty and manipulation, his gaze flicking over her like she was a possession he might steal just for amusement. She swallowed hard, heat prickling her cheeks, her heart hammering so loudly she feared both men could hear it, and Kalen's voice finally rumbled low, quiet, dangerous, a warning threaded through every syllable as he said Cashin's name, his tone like gravel sliding over steel, sending a shiver down Ember's spine. Cashin only chuckled softly, sauntering in with the kind of arrogance only noble blood could grant, his silk coat brushing the straw-littered floor. As he leaned lazily against a stall door, eyes narrowing at Ember with unspoken mockery, his presence invasive, unwelcome, yet his smirk dared her to flinch or look away, and though she kept her head bowed, she could feel his gaze lingering too long, crawling over her like a shadow, making her skin crawl, and Kalen's sudden shift forward was so subtle yet so commanding that even Cashin straightened slightly, the tension rippling like static, the silence punctuated only by the distant snort of a restless stallion, and Ember's lungs felt tight, her disguise, her years of careful invisibility, all teetering on the edge of collapse as Kalen's protective stance grew more obvious, a silent declaration in the tilt of his chin, in the way his shoulders squared, a message that Ember didn't fully understand but could feel like a warm shield pressed between her and Cashin's sneer, and Cashin's smirk faltered briefly, his eyes flicking between them as though trying to decipher Kalen's interest, before he scoffed and muttered something under his breath about wasting time with the help, the venom in his tone enough to make Ember's stomach twist, yet Kalen didn't flinch, his glowing eyes narrowing like a wolf assessing a threat, and though no words were exchanged, Cashin shifted uncomfortably, the tension thickening until he finally turned and strode out, his boots echoing against the wooden floorboards, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and a suffocating silence that settled heavily in the stable, the door slamming behind him with a sharp crack that made Ember jump. Kalen didn't move for several heartbeats, his broad frame still like a mountain carved from shadow, his glowing eyes fixed on the door as if ensuring no one lingered outside, and Ember's hands trembled, her pulse racing so fast she felt dizzy, every instinct screaming to flee yet somehow rooted in place by the sheer gravity of his presence, the soft flicker of lantern light catching in his golden irises as he finally turned to her, stepping forward with slow, deliberate grace, his boots silent against the hay-strewn floor, and she found herself holding her breath as he stopped close enough for her to feel the warmth radiating off him, his gaze no longer predatory but curious, intense, almost reverent, and his hand lifted, not to touch her, but to hover just inches from her cheek, as if testing invisible boundaries, his voice dropping so low it was nearly a growl as he repeated his earlier words, softer this time, more certain, "You're mine," and Ember's breath hitched, her mind spinning, fear and confusion tangling in her chest like thorns, yet beneath it all was a strange, dangerous pull she didn't understand, a magnetic force that made her want to lean closer even as every rational thought screamed to run, and Kalen's expression softened briefly, a flicker of something like longing flashing across his face before he stepped back, his jaw tight, his golden eyes dimming slightly. Why, as if he'd wrestled back control, his hand lowering slowly to his side, and Ember felt a rush of air escape her lungs she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her knees weak as she gripped the edge of a stall for balance, and though she wanted to speak, to ask him what he meant, no words came, her voice locked in her throat, and he didn't push her to answer, didn't demand an explanation, only studied her like she was a secret he'd finally uncovered, his gaze moving over her face with a reverence that felt both terrifying and intimate, and the soft rustle of a horse shifting in its stall was the only sound as the silence stretched, heavy yet charged, a fragile thread connecting them in that moment, and Ember's heart pounded with the weight of everything unsaid, with the realization that this man, this cursed Alpha King who terrified the entire court, saw her, truly saw her, and wasn't afraid. The air in the stables felt charged, every flicker of lantern light stretching shadows across the wooden beams, the smell of hay and snow-damp leather heavy in Ember's lungs as Kalen's piercing gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable, a storm of restraint and hunger flickering in the depths of his glowing eyes, and she couldn't move, couldn't speak, rooted to the spot as if his presence alone had bound her in place, her fingers curling tightly into the coarse fabric of her apron while her mind raced. Thoughts tangled between fear of discovery and the strange, magnetic pull she felt toward him, a pull she didn't dare name, and his silence was worse than words, every heartbeat stretching painfully loud in her chest as he studied her, head tilted slightly like a predator trying to understand prey that refused to run, his breath slow and steady, filling the space between them with quiet dominance. And Ember swallowed hard, her throat dry, her heart hammering so violently she thought he might hear it, but Kaelin didn't move closer, didn't reach for her again, only let his sharp gaze wander over her features as though committing every detail to memory, his expression shifting minutely, something soft flickering over his sharp features before it vanished, replaced by that same cool control, and Ember shivered, though the stable was warm compared to the courtyard's winter chill, her body trembling with adrenaline as his voice finally cut through the tension, low and even, a murmur that held weight like steel. "You should not tremble," he said, though not unkindly, more like an observation, a soft reprimand, and Ember blinked up at him, startled by his tone, which carried neither cruelty nor pity but a quiet certainty that unsettled her even more, and she lowered her eyes quickly, her breath uneven, whispering a soft apology she wasn't sure he wanted, the words barely audible, but Kaelin's sharp hearing caught them, and he tilted his head, studying her further, the faintest trace of curiosity in his golden gaze, and then, without a word, he turned slightly, glancing toward the stable doors as if sensing movement beyond them, his shoulders tensing. And Ember felt a jolt of fear spike through her as she instinctively stepped back, the tension in the air coiling tighter, every creak of the wood and rustle of hay suddenly deafening, and Kaelin's nostrils flared slightly as he took in the sense of the space, his body a wall of raw power and control, his stance protective now rather than predatory, and Ember's chest tightened at the subtle shift, at the realization that he was guarding her, not because she mattered, surely, but because someone approaching might pose a threat, and she instinctively moved closer to the nearest stall, her back pressing against the rough wood as she tried to steady her breathing, the soft snort of a horse nearby grounding her only slightly, and Kaelin's golden gaze flicked back to her for a heartbeat, reassurance and command mingled in that single glance, making her breath hitch, and then he stepped forward, tighter in her chest, and then he unlatched the door with a soft click, swinging it open to face whoever dared approach, his towering frame filling the threshold like a living wall of power, and Ember's pulse roared in her ears as a gust of icy wind swept into the stable, carrying with it voices that silenced abruptly at the sight of him, the flickering torchlight outside casting jagged shadows across his sharp features, his dominance radiating so strongly that even without words, the guards hesitated, their fear palpable in the charged air, and Ember watched from her hiding place, breath shallow, her body frozen with the knowledge that Kaelin's world, this world of power and blood, was far more dangerous than she'd imagined, yet somehow she'd been pulled into its orbit, and now, as she clung to the rough wood behind her, praying for the voices outside to fade, her eyes never left Kaelin, her fear momentarily eclipsed by awe at the sheer control he held over the space, his presence, commanding silence, obedience, and respect without a single word spoken. The guards lingered at the threshold, their torches casting wild flickers of orange light across the packed snow outside, their faces tense as they shifted uneasily under the Alpha King's steady, golden gaze, his presence so commanding that none dared step forward, the weight of his dominance pressing against them like an unseen force, and Ember, still pressed against the rough wooden beam behind her, held her breath, her heart pounding as the scent of cold metal and horse sweat drifted in with the winter air, the crackle of a nearby lantern filling the silence between the shallow breaths of the men outside, and Kaelin stood unmoving, his posture deceptively relaxed yet thrumming with danger, his towering frame filling the doorway completely, a wall of shadows and power that made even the armed guards falter, and one of them, braver or perhaps more foolish than the rest, cleared his throat and muttered something about a disturbance near the palace walls, his voice tight and low, and Kaelin's response came slow, deliberate, each word a blade of authority that cut through the cold air, a quiet command for them to sweep the area and leave the stables undisturbed, his tone calm but carrying an edge that sent a visible shiver through the men, and Ember could see their hesitation as they exchanged nervous glances, none daring to question him, and finally, after a tense pause, the group retreated, their boots crunching against gravel, their voices fading into the distance until only the soft sound of the wind remained, carrying the faint creak of the stable door as Kaelin swung it shut with a low thud that echoed through the wooden beams, sealing them once more in the dimly lit space, and Ember's chest rose and fell rapidly, her pulse thundering in her ears as Kaelin turned slowly, his glowing eyes catching the flickering lantern light like molten gold, and he looked at her not with anger or suspicion, but with a strange, quiet intensity that made her throat tighten, a look that felt like it peeled back every layer of her carefully constructed disguise, and she shrank back slightly, pressing herself harder against the beam, though the movement was instinct rather than thought, her breath shallow and uneven as he took a single step toward her, the sound of his boots against the wooden floorboard soft yet deafening in the stillness, and she swallowed hard, unsure whether to bow, speak, or run, every nerve in her body alight as he drew closer, his expression unreadable, his scent, cedar and earth, threaded with something darker, sharper, filling her senses until she felt dizzy, and when he finally stopped a breath away, the tension between them was so thick it felt like the very air resisted movement, his gaze sweeping over her face as though searching for something only he understood, and Ember's trembling hands clutched her skirts tighter, the fabric wrinkling between her fingers as her mind raced, wondering if he suspected the truth about her, if he already knew she wasn't what she seemed, and Kalen's voice, when it came, was low, a whisper of thunder that made her heart stutter. "You fear me," he murmured, not as a question, but as a statement, his tone holding neither pride nor disappointment, only certainty, and she flinched slightly at the words, her lips parting as she struggled for an answer, the silence stretching between them like a taut string ready to snap, and finally she managed a soft, breathless whisper, "Shouldn't I?" And his jaw tightened at that, the faintest flicker of something dangerous crossing his features, though it wasn't directed at her, and his golden eyes darkened, glowing brighter in the shadows as though her words had stirred something deep within him, a storm barely held in check, and he leaned in slightly, his gaze locking with hers in a way that made it impossible to look away, his voice even softer now, a quiet growl that sent a shiver down her spine. "Perhaps," he murmured, "but not for the reasons you think," and Ember's heart thudded painfully at the cryptic words, confusion swirling through her as she searched his face for answers, finding only that same inscrutable expression, a mask of calm over something untamed, and before she could form a response, he moved past her suddenly, the shift in motion startling her as he brushed by, his cloak whispering against her arm, and he crossed the stable to inspect a nearby window, his posture alert, every motion precise, as though still wary of danger outside despite sending the guards away, and Ember, unable to stop herself, watched him, her breath steadying slightly though her body remained tense, her mind spinning with questions she didn't dare ask, and the quiet of the stable seemed louder now, the crackle of the lantern and the soft huff of a horse filling the heavy silence, Kalen's presence filling every corner of the space even when his back was turned, his broad shoulders casting long shadows across the wooden floor, and Ember's fingers loosened slightly on her skirts, though she stayed rooted to the beam, her instincts torn between fleeing and staying still, as though either choice could draw unwanted attention, and then Kalen turned his head, his glowing gaze flicking to her again, sharp and assessing, and she froze under the weight of it, heat creeping up her neck as he studied her for a long moment, and then, without warning, he spoke again, his tone clipped yet calm. "Stay close to the servants' quarters tonight," he ordered, and she blinked, startled by the unexpected command, her lips parting slightly as she hesitated, unsure if he was truly addressing her or speaking in general, but his eyes remained fixed on hers, steady and unyielding, and she nodded quickly, murmuring a quiet, "Yes, my lord," and the faintest glimmer of satisfaction crossed his features before it vanished, replaced by that same unreadable calm, and Kalen stepped back toward the door, his hand lingering briefly on the hilt of his dagger, his gaze sweeping the dim stable one last time before he opened it, letting a gust of icy wind sweep in, and he paused at the threshold, glancing over his shoulder at her with an expression she couldn't decipher, half warning, half something else, and then he stepped out into the darkness, vanishing into the cold night like a shadow swallowed by the snow, leaving Ember alone in the stable, her heart still pounding, her hands trembling as she sank onto the edge of a hay bale, her mind a storm of fear and confusion, yet beneath it all, a spark of something more dangerous than fear flickered deep within her chest, something she dared not name, not yet, and as the door swung shut behind him, sealing her in the dim warmth of the lantern light, she hugged her arms around herself, the scent of cedar and snow still lingering in the air, and whispered a prayer to whatever god still listened that she would survive. Whatever game she had just been pulled into, the silence in the stables lingered long after Kalen's departure, wrapping around Ember like a heavy cloak, and she sat frozen, clutching the edge of the hay bale, the lantern light flickering over her pale knuckles, her mind racing with unanswered questions, fear gnawing at her chest, yet beneath it a strange, undeniable pull tugged at her heart as though she had been marked by his presence in a way she couldn't erase, and though every instinct screamed for her to stay hidden, she rose shakily to her feet, her breath shallow in the cold air, and pushed open the stable door just enough to peer into the courtyard where moonlight spilled across the cobblestones like silver, the distant howl of a wolf echoing from the forest beyond the walls, a sound that sent shivers down her spine, and she hesitated, torn between retreating to safety and following the trail of his power that seemed to linger in the very air, but before she could decide, a rustle in the shadows made her spin around, heart pounding as a figure emerged, Cashin, smirking as always, his eyes glinting with cruel amusement as he stepped into the pale moonlight, his posture relaxed but his presence sharp, predatory, and Ember instinctively backed up, her hand brushing against the stable wall for support, the tension between them electric as he tilted his head mockingly. "Interesting night for a kitchen rat to be lurking," he drawled, his tone laced with venom, and Ember's pulse quickened, her voice catching in her throat, yet before she could answer, his expression hardened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his face as he stepped closer, his words dropping to a hiss. "You don't belong here," he spat, his gaze narrowing like he was seeing straight through her disguise, and Ember froze, terror rooting her in place as she realized he might know, or at least suspect, the truth she had buried for so long, and when he reached for her arm, fingers curling around her wrist with bruising force, she gasped softly, instinctively trying to pull away, but he held her firm, leaning close, his breath warm against her ear as he whispered, "He's protecting you." "Why?" And before she could answer, a deep, feral growl split the air, low and deadly, making the hair on her arms rise, and Cashin stiffened, his grip faltering as a massive shadow moved behind him, Kalen. Emerging from the darkness with eyes glowing like molten gold, his entire body radiating lethal power, his presence so intense that even Cashin, who was known for his arrogance, faltered, taking a step back, though his smirk quickly returned, masking his unease, and Kalen's voice was a blade of steel, calm yet deadly. "Let her go," he commanded, his gaze locked on Cashin with a ferocity that made Ember's breath hitch, and Cashin chuckled dryly but obeyed, releasing her wrist and raising his hands in mock surrender, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Of course, Your Majesty. I was only concerned for your guest," and Kalen's jaw tightened, his expression a mask of control though the raw danger rolling off him was palpable, and Cashin, sensing he'd pushed enough, bowed with a mocking flourish before striding off into the shadows, his laughter echoing faintly behind him, leaving Ember trembling in Kalen's shadow, her pulse still racing as Kalen turned to her, his gaze softening slightly, though his voice remained firm. "You should not wander alone," he said, his tone carrying a weight of unspoken worry, and Ember could only nod, her throat too tight for words, and then, in a motion so fluid it startled her, he reached for her hand, his fingers curling gently around hers, warm and steady, and the sudden contact sent a jolt through her entire being, her breath catching as his thumb brushed against her skin, his glowing eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her heart ache, and in that moment, something shifted in the air between them, a bond neither could deny. A pull stronger than fear, stronger than duty, and Ember felt tears sting her eyes, emotions she had locked away for years bubbling to the surface as Kalen whispered softly, almost to himself, "I knew it. I felt it the moment I saw you," and Ember's lips trembled, her voice breaking as she asked, What am I to you?" And his expression softened further, the Alpha King shedding his mask of cold authority for a heartbeat as he lifted his hand to her cheek, his touch gentle, reverent. "Mine," he murmured, the single word carrying more power than any title or crown, and Ember's heart stuttered, her breath trembling as the truth settled deep within her bones, a truth she had feared yet longed for, and before she could speak, Kalen closed the distance, his lips brushing hers with a tenderness that contrasted the raw strength he carried, the kiss soft yet searing, igniting something ancient within her soul, and she melted into him, her hands clutching his cloak as if anchoring herself to reality, the bond between them sparking to life like fire meeting dry tinder, a bond that could not be broken. And as he pulled back just slightly, his golden gaze burning into hers, a fierce determination lit his features. "They'll come for you," he whispered, "but they'll have to go through me," and Ember felt a surge of courage rise in her chest, his words wrapping around her like armor, and as he drew her closer, shielding her with his towering frame, a howl echoed again from beyond the palace walls, but this time it was answered, a deep, commanding howl that reverberated through the courtyard, a declaration of dominance that made even the horses still in their stalls tremble. And Ember knew without a doubt that no one would dare touch her now, not while he stood between her and the world, and though danger still loomed in the shadows, the fear that had haunted her for years began to fade, replaced by the steady warmth of his arms and the unspoken promise in his gaze, and she closed her eyes, leaning into him, breathing in the scent of cedar and snow, knowing that for the first time in years, she was safe, truly safe, and as Kaelin's cloak enveloped her, shielding her from the bitter cold, he pressed his forehead against hers, murmuring softly, "You were never meant to hide," and she swallowed hard, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, her voice barely a whisper as she answered, "And I don't want to anymore," and Kaelin's lips curved into a faint, rare smile, his hand cradling her face as he said with quiet conviction, "Then stand with me," and Ember nodded, her fear replaced with a fierce resolve as she met his gaze, her heart beating in time with his, and in that moment, the tension that had haunted them for days broke like a storm passing, replaced with something deeper, something eternal, and as he wrapped his arm around her, leading her back toward the castle, the moonlight bathed them both in silver, illuminating the bond forged not of power or fear, but of destiny, a bond that neither crown nor kingdom could sever, and Ember, for the first time in a decade, allowed herself to hope, not as a servant, not as a fugitive, but as a woman who had been chosen, claimed, and loved by the Alpha King himself, her heart steady as they stepped through the palace gates side by side, ready to face whatever darkness dared to challenge them, together.